Chapter 9, Revolution and the End of History. It is here, indeed, that the old master-slave dialectic reappears for one last time, before Kojèv's universal and homogeneous state would seem to have put an end to both masters and slaves and to issue in the era of plebeian equality, an astute prediction of universal convergence which for modern readers only, but significantly, amidst the leveling function of mass culture. For more traditional readers, however, Hegel's historical narrative will appear to have reached its climax in the rather Kantian evocation of morality, or in other words, in the emergence of a kind of inner-directed citizenship. In order to correct this impression, it will be necessary to take a step backwards in historical time. The pages on the French Revolution are among the most celebrated in the Phenomenology. They theorize the absolute negativity of Rousseau's general will, in which no middle term is available between the absolute subject and the individual self, so that their only relationship can be that of unmediated negation. The sole work and deed of universal freedom is therefore death, the coldest and meanest of deaths, with no more significance than cutting off a head of cabbage or swallowing a mouthful of water. 436/360. For in the unison of the revolutionary one, we have lost the productiveness of that division, the one becoming two, the differentiation and articulation of the social substance into its various opposites, that inaugurated the reign of the social, or the collective, or spirit at the beginning of Hegel's narrative. Yet he is anxious to avoid the implication of a cyclical vision of history. Out of this tumult, spirit would be thrown back to its starting point, to the ethical and real world of culture, which would have been merely refreshed and rejuvenated by the fear of the Lord and Master which has again entered men's hearts. Spirit would have to traverse anew and continually repeat this cycle of necessity if the result were only the complete interpenetration of self-consciousness and substance, an interpenetration in which self-consciousness, which has experienced the negative power of its universal essence acting on it, would desire to know and find itself, not as this particular individual, but only as a universal, and therefore, too, would be able to endure the objective reality of universal spirit, a reality, excluding self-consciousness qua particular. But in absolute freedom there was no reciprocal action between a consciousness that is immersed in the complexities of existence, or that sets itself specific aims and thoughts, and a valid external world, whether of reality or thought. Instead, the world was absolutely in the form of consciousness as a universal will, and equally self-consciousness was drawn together out of the whole expanse of existence or manifested aims and judgments, and concentrated into the simple self. The culture to which it attains in interaction with that essence is, therefore, the grandest and the last, is that of seeing its pure, simple reality immediately vanish and pass away into empty nothingness. 361-362, Der Geist where USD sem Tumult zu seinem Ausgangspunkt, der Zeitdichten und Realen Welt der Bildung, so extrudet, welch durch die Furt des Herrn, die wieder in die Gemeiete gekommen, erfrischt und verjüngt wurden. Der Geist meifert diesen Kreislauf der Notwendigkeit von neuen Durchlaufen und immer wiederholen, wenn die vollkommene Durchdringung des Selbstbewusstseins und der Substanz das Resultat war, ein Durchdringung, worin das Selbstbewusstsein, das Diogenes Negativkraftseins allgemeinen Wissen erfahren, sich nicht als dieses Besond, sondern nur als allgemeines Wissen und finden wollt und daher auch Diogen standleik, es als Besond ausschliefen die Wirklichkeit des allgemeinen Geistsertragung kommt dort, aber in der absoluten Freiheit wo weder das Bewusstsein, das in mannigfaltiges das ihm versenkt ist oder das sich bestimmt zwei Gedanken festsetzt, noch kein du viel Geld in die Welt, es sei der Wirklichkeit oder des Denkens, miteinander in which selwirken, sondern die Welt schlicht in der Form des Bewusstseins, als allgemeiner Will, und eben so das Selbstbewusstsein süße Mensch solche US allem ausgiedenten das in oder mannigfaltigem zwei Teil in das Einfach. Selbst. Die Bildung, die es in der which selwirken mit genem Wissen erlangen, ist daher die erhabenst und letzt, sein reine Einfach Wirklichkeit unmittelbar verschwinden und in das Leer nichts teilbert hin zu sehen. 438-9, Hegel seems to want to conclude this historical process with a humanization of the external world. The post-revolutionary subject now has an awareness of self-conscious spirit it did not have when the experience of history was some mere external and incomprehensible necessity and constraint. Now spirit knows itself to be a universal will. The universal will is its pure knowing and willing, Neins Wissen und Wollen, and it is the universal will qua this knowing and willing. 440/363, and with this collective self-consciousness Hegel is content to pass to its purely individual form as morality, or citizenship. We may assume he thought its collective action would take the form of the framing of constitutions. But as we have seen, Hegel is only approaching that absolute historical present which is the end of his world. 1807 is only the dawning of the Napoleonic consolidation of the revolution which will remain the framework for Hegel's political and social thought, even after its defeat. Kojèv therefore quite properly takes the next step and as it were writes a new last chapter in the historical series. This is the condition in which Napoleon, or Stalin, depending on how we read Kojèv's code words, the master of the world, is reflected in the equality of the Napoleonic citizens, who are the synthesis of the master warrior and the slave worker. What is new in this state is that everyone is, from time to time, warrior, conscription, and all participate in social labor. 146. Meanwhile this now fully human condition will result in the supreme value of the Kojevian ethos, that of Befriedigung or satisfaction, the enjoyment of absolute collective self-consciousness or of a fully human and transparent world. The figure of Napoleon then generates yet another shape or subject, it is that of Hegel himself or the sage. To be sure, only the head of the universal and homogeneous state, Napoleon, is really satisfied, that is to say, recognized by all in his personal reality and value. He alone is therefore truly free, more than all the heads of state before him, who were always limited by the specific differences of all families, classes and nations. But all citizens are here potentially satisfied, for each one can become this head or chief, whose personal, particular, action is at one and the same time a universal act, an act of state, or in other words the doing of all, das tun aller Umjeds. For there is no longer any heredity, as non-human natural pagan element. Each can therefore actualize his desire for recognition, on condition he accepts, element of mastery. The risk of death competition implies in this state, political struggle, a risk that in any case guarantees the serio of the candidates, and also on condition he has previously taken part in society's activities of construction, in a collective labor which maintains the state in its existence and reality, element of servitude and service, which also guarantees the competence of the candidates. The satisfaction of the citizen is thus a result of the synthesis in him of the master warrior and the slave worker. So what is new in this state is that everyone in it is from time to time a warrior, universal conscription, and that everyone also participates in social labor. As for the sage, Hegel, he limits himself to understanding the state and its chief, the citizen, both warrior and worker, and finally himself, by way of the phenomenology / at the conclusion of which he encounters himself as the result, the final end and integration of the historical process of humanity. This sage, who reveals, by knowledge, reality, as incarnated in Napoleon, is the incarnation of absolute spirit. He is thus, if you like, the incarnate God of whom the Christians dreamt. The real or veritable Christ equals Napoleon Jesus plus Hegel Logos. Incarnation therefore takes place, not in the middle but at the very end of historical time. ILH 146-7, translation mine. Such is Kajev's narrativization of absolute spirit. It has the merit of grounding the possibility of knowing the social totality in its post-revolutionary preconditions and of adding an historical context to what might only bewilderingly come before us as a disembodied form of pure thought. I have, however, already suggested that it is no longer satisfying to anthropomorphize the notion of absolute spirit, to make it into a character whose appearance marks the end of an historical narrative. Yet I now want to argue that despite the enrichment of the Hegelian problematic which we owe to Kajev, his rewriting of the Phenomenology falls back behind Hegel's own narrative in significant ways. For one thing, the dialectical structure of his universal and homogeneous state replicates Hegel's dialectic of the Roman Empire, as I hinted above. It confronts us with an opposition between the unique subjectivity of the emperor, this time Napoleon, and those, equal yet without his essential satisfaction, of the masses as such. Kajev wrote indeed in the period of the long Cold War in which such charismatic figures, from Stalin to de Gaulle, from Hitler to EDR, played a more than significant role, a period which seems to have come to an end with the end of the post-war period, or the advent of postmodernity and late capitalism. For one thing, it is important for contemporary readers not to confuse the celebrity status with which we are familiar today with the operative meaning of Webberian charisma, which is rather different from the appeal of an attractive personality or even the power of a personality as such. Stalin, however interesting for us, does not seem to have been blessed with the kind of personality that radiates fascination, while Hitler's power was that of the spellbinding orator rather than of character as such. Indeed, we must affirm, against Kajev, that true charisma includes the power of the sage and is inseparable from it, for what Kajev calls the sage can essentially be described in Lacanian terms as the big other itself, the subject supposed to know the locus of a wisdom and authority structurally unavailable to the masses of equal subjects who are also, in principle, equal to him. Meanwhile, in a second moment of this argument, we must now assert that the days of the big other are over, a proposition empirically verifiable in world leaders everywhere, but which has its ground in the spirit of the age more generally, which can be characterized as that of cynical reason, whose existence is rather to be accounted for on the other side of Kajev's opposition, namely the historically new condition of his post-revolutionary population. For the kernel of truth of Kajev's end of history is essentially to be found on the social level, rather than on that political level which his terminology of a universal empire seems to suggest. The convergence he implicitly posits between the US and the Soviet Union is not a political one, it is that of the social equality of societies which have swept traditional class culture away, or have never known it in the first place. In European class culture, the triumphant bourgeoisie, while displacing the old aristocracy, borrows the very structure and dynamic of the latter's culture, and perpetuates the latter's hierarchies in new forms and with new content. Post-revolutionary society, however, and today we can certainly include China along with the Soviet Union in that category, has by a process of violent leveling destroyed the very social structures of class culture, while, by virtue of the absence of feudalism and the accumulation of immigrants, as well as the standardizing effects of mass culture, the United States has also escaped both the European class structures and those of non-European, pre-modern, caste societies. But it is important to understand this process socially and culturally, rather than economically. The prodigious social leveling which is identified here certainly does not exclude the emergence of wealth and of profound distinctions between rich and poor, even in the socialist countries. Nor is it in any way to be understood as the end of classes in their economic sense. There are still workers and managers in these societies, there is still profit and exploitation, reserve armies of the unemployed, and so on and so forth. But the new cultural equality, I would prefer to characterize it as plebeianization, is infused with a powerful hatred of hierarchy and special privileges and with a passionate resentment of caste distinctions and inherited cultural superiority. It is permitted to be wealthy, as long as the rich man is as vulgar as everyone else. This universal democratic impulse is negative rather than positive. It is fired by a passion for egalitarianism which is not quite the same as the ressentiment against success, although it can easily degenerate into that, and which is akin to the older revolutionary mob spirit without being revolutionary, insofar as all these equals have in principle achieved what Kajev calls satisfaction, which is, as he significantly notes, itself quite different from happiness. 149. Kajev's achievement is thus paradoxically to have described the waning of that master-slave dialectic which he was credited with reviving in modern philosophy. In terms of power, for example, the place of the absent master, qui est perhaps, bouger les plots du styx, great multinational corporations now deploy the investments of worldwide capital, themselves enjoying the twin status of personification on the legal level, the soulful corporation, while on that of the social imaginary or political unconscious they become more and more difficult to visualize or to represent. But I believe that Hegel is here more advanced than Kajev and has more productive clues to offer us to the continuing significance of that recognition which Kajev restricted to the interpersonal struggle between master and slave. We must therefore retrace our steps and reread Hegel's account of post-revolutionary consciousness, while historicizing that final moment, morality after Kant, the autonomy of the citizen, which traditional readers have also read as an end of history, the achievement of freedom and democracy, albeit as a rather different kind of end of history, a bourgeois one, than the plebeianization of Kajev's universal state. A number of categorical oppositions need to be taken into account here, even though it will only be a question here of adding an economic dialectic to Hegel's essentially political one, both of them mobilizing Kajev's new population of social subjects. But, perhaps, insofar as the political is the affair of the masters and the economic the production of the slaves or workers, this reduplication and parallelism itself remains faithful to Kajev's initial insight. At any rate, it will be necessary to play these developments out along several axes. We recall that in the older religious dialectic, in which Rome is opposed to Christianity, what counted was a dialectic of the abstract and the concrete. The Roman emperor was the locus of subjectivity, the uniquely concrete individual in a world of empty or abstract juridical equality. The concrete subjectivity of an inner Christianity then answers the needs of that population, giving it content at the same time that the emperor's subjectivity was revealed to be empty and abstract. The same dialectic was however repeated within the unhappy consciousness of Christianity, in which the uniquely concrete and individual subjectivity is other and elsewhere for its empty subjects, longing for their individual fulfillment and salvation. Alongside this opposition of the abstract and the concrete, we must identify another one, which is registered in the sequence of Hegel's chapters, namely the collective, revolutionary terror, and the individual, morality. The Roman emperor, not to speak of the Napoleon of Kajev, is not finally able to stand as a synthesis of these two dimensions of social life. Rousseau's general will stand as another, more desperate and more ingenious attempt, to put these categories back together in such a way that the complex term is not a personification or an anthropomorphic figure of any kind, and yet somehow enacts the collectivity of the social in a fashion that excludes majorities, pluralities or even unanimities, that, in other words, evades the quantitative altogether. It is thus the revolutionary subject, or better still, the fitting Lukács-Shorn subject-object of history, provided, once again, we are able to neutralize the irresistible slippage of the concept and of the word subject towards individual subjectivity and anthropomorphism. Unfortunately, this is impossible, and even seen as an event rather than a concept, the event of this axial revolution itself. The general will slips fatally into abstraction, and lethal abstraction at that. According to the letter of Hegel's text then, rather than following Kajev's insertion of the Napoleonic universal state, the failure of the collective, of the general will and its revolution, is followed by what looks like a restoration of the individual and its subjectivity, now, since Kant, reorganized in terms of personal morality. Indeed, the Kantian categorical imperative is also meant to be a new and original reunification of individual and collective, insofar as it enjoins us to grasp our individual acts as universal laws. Politically, the Kantian ethic is supposed to project the new autonomous subjectivity of the citizen, and politically to correspond to the great project of the age, from the American Revolution onwards, which is the framing of the written constitution. Yet the restoration did not exactly turn out as Hegel anticipated, and we will posit the failure of this post-revolutionary subject just as surely as that of the revolutionary one. Neither the general will nor the categorical imperative effectuate that reconciliation of the individual subjective and the universal collective which, if achieved, would presumably spell the end of history as such, or, if you prefer Marx's formulation, the end of prehistory. But failure here means simply that Kantian morality, like the revolution of the general will, along with its prior conceptualization or theorization by Rousseau, is now to be taken as an historical event, or, to keep to the spirit of Hegel's experience of history, as a determinate contradiction, one which brings new problems and new contradictions into actuality along with it. Yet Hegel does introduce a wholly new element at the end of this chapter, which I will consider to be the end of Hegel's narrative, broken off in mid-course by history itself, and to which the supplementary non-narrative chapters on religion and absolute spirit have been added, as though in afterthought. This is a new and heightened kind of recognition which will now open up two new and parallel outcomes for the phenomenologist's historical narrative, on the side of the subject and of the object respectively, outcomes which are hardly to be read as the endings of history either, but which break off at the present of our own time as Hegel's did at his. I a new note is indeed struck by the Dostoevskian scene of guilt and confession that appears to be meant to bring the Kantian ethic of the solemn or ethical obligation up to date, not only to reintroduce genuine subjectivity and feeling into the notoriously dry and abstract world of Kantian duty, but also, in a more fundamental way, to replace obligation with immanence, and the infinite futurity of duty with the already fulfilled satisfaction of activity. It is at this point that Hegel seems to me to revise and transform his earlier version of recognition and to move considerably beyond what Kajev so insightfully brought to our attention in Hegel's earlier chapters. What is at stake, indeed, is the individual's recognition of his responsibility for the law, something rather different than his responsibility to the law or before the law, yet which includes both those nuances. This is a complex variation on the idealist or speculative identification of subject with object, and bears very decisively on the whole question of alienation and transparency as those play themselves out in the social and political spheres. For the solution brought by the tradition of German idealist philosophy from Kant on to the problem of citizenship and obedience involves the acknowledgement of the seemingly external laws, including the Constitution, as something I myself have brought into being, to which I am therefore bound by an identification much more intense than rational choice or freedom. I have myself produced the law, and therefore it is not alien to me, it belongs to me, and there can thus be no question of my disobedience. This is, to be sure, a very different theory of the claims of legal authority than any contractual theories of society, and it is clearly at work in that Dostoevskian dialectic of conscience and guilt which we have so surprisingly found at work in Hegel's account of modern individualistic ethics, where the acknowledgement of guilt now turns out to be the familiar discovery by the Hegelian subject of its profound kinship and even oneness with the object. Nor is the word transparency out of place here insofar as it signifies my reconciliation with the social order and my discovery and acceptance of my own complicity with it. Now to be sure, this particular theory of legal obligation has its grim side, insofar as it seems to require, not merely a confession of guilt, but a consent to punishment, on the part of the criminal, seen now, not as a rebel against an alien order, but an unhappy consciousness divided against itself and caught between its own illusions about its private or subjective desires and acts, and that other self in fact unconsciously embodied in the law it has itself transgressed. The monstrous shadows thrown by such a position are to be observed in Kleist's Michael Kohlhaas, or in the following terrible remark by Kant: even if civil society were to dissolve itself, with the consent of all its members, for example, if a people who inhabited an island decided to separate and to disperse to other parts of the world, the last murderer in prison would first have to be executed in order that each should receive his deserts and that the people should not bear the guilt of a capital crime through failing to insist on its punishment. Carried it is against this well-nigh inhuman rigor that Hegel's evocation of pardon and redemption is set, yet we must understand this in a more fundamental framework, namely that of the individual's recognition that he is himself the author of the social and legal fabric that seems to condemn him, in other words, that this seemingly alien institution of the law is his own making, well in advance of any individual admission of culpability, any purely individual repentance or expression of regret for the act and guilt before society. This is then a wholly new sense of recognition, not that of the enigmatic other as a human like myself or an embodiment of the same freedom as which I know myself, but rather a recognition of myself in the object world and its social institutions, a recognition of these as my own constructions, as the only temporarily alienated embodiments of my own activity. For what looked before like the purely antisocial or socio-pathological act, crime, or crime as considered from a bourgeois ethical perspective, an aberrant refusal of the social order and the gratuitous violence of a sick and isolated individual, now as ethics slowly turns into the institution of bourgeois law and confession seals the acknowledgement of my own responsibility for the very construction and production of the social in the first place, what I will call a Sartrean assumption or recognition or reappropriation of the hitherto alienated social order. Such reassumption then slowly turns back into the political protest of the individuals against that alienation and a form of revolt that seeks to prolong the revolutionary transformation of society into the reappropriation of its alienated institutions by radical democratization and plebeianization. What lies beyond the horizon of this reassumption of the social and the political is the human age itself, the fully human and humanly produced world, and the end of alienation and external forms of power and domination. The post-revolutionary situation carried the general will universal homogeneous society self-ext other, yet this is as it were only the subjective form taken by the prolongation of the Hegelian dialectic into modernity. We must also identify the objective form of this process, something suggested by a different feature of the dialectic of recognition, namely the labor on matter performed by the slave. When we recall the rereading that has been proposed above of the post-Kantian ethic, the way in which the individual is called upon to acknowledge the law as his own production, we may begin to see that a whole logic of production emerges here on the objective side of the modern contradiction, and also that it differs from the Roman/Christian moment insofar as it is the production of a whole world. Just as the modern dialectic on the one hand foreground the subjective opposition between universal abstract freedom and an equally universal private life, so here we now find two worlds opposed to each other at the same time that they are little more than two dimensions or faces of the same, now global, historical moment. One of these has to do with the world of objects produced by the slave and his modern equivalents, the other has to do with the humanization of that world and its denaturalization, that is to say, with our recognition of that entire post-natural world as the product of human praxis and production. The object world confronted by the post-revolutionary subject is indeed here evoked by Hegel in the most startling and unexpected fashion. It is the world of utilitarianism, which is by no means judged as negatively as one might expect in the context of Hegelian idealism, even though a certain unassimilability of that world of objects is also stressed. For alongside that empty husk of pure being which is posited by the unity of deism, or of the surviving religious remnant, the world of content, of individual things, or what Heidegger would call the ontic, or science, that object world, even though it places itself outside of that unity, is an alternation which does not return into itself, an alternation of being for another, and of being for self. It is reality in the way this is an object for the actual consciousness of pure insight, utility, 428/353. The alternation theorized by Hegel here indeed foreshadows that between production and consumption in the commodity form, a combination itself underscored by an even more explicit rehearsal of the process. Both ways of viewing the positive and the negative relations of the finite to the in itself are, however, in fact equally necessary, and everything is thus as much something in itself as it is for another. In other words, everything is useful. Everything is at the mercy of everything else, now lets itself be used by others and is for them, and now, so to speak, stands again on its hind legs, is standoffish towards the other, is for itself, and uses the other in its turn. From this, we see what is the essence and the place of man regarded as a thing that is conscious of this relation. As he immediately is, as a natural consciousness per se, man is good, as an individual he is absolute and all else exists for him, and moreover, since the moments have for him, qua self-conscious animal, the significance of universality, everything exists for his pleasure and delight and, as one who has come from the hand of God, he walks the earth as in a garden planted for him. He must also have plucked the fruit of the tree of the knowledge of good and evil. He possesses in this an advantage which distinguishes him from all other creatures, for it happens that his intrinsically good nature is also so constituted that an excess of pleasure does it harm, or rather his individuality has also its beyond within it, can go beyond itself and destroy itself. To counter this, reason is for him a useful instrument for keeping this excess within bounds, or rather for preserving himself when he oversteps his limit, for this is the power of consciousness. Enjoyment on the part of the conscious, intrinsically universal being, must not itself be something determinate as regards variety and duration, but universal. Measure or proportion has therefore the function of preventing pleasure in its variety and duration from being cut short, i.e. the function of measure is immoderation. Just as everything is useful to man, so man is useful too, and his vocation is to make himself a member of the group, of use for the common good and serviceable to all. The extent to which he looks after his own interests must also be matched by the extent to which he serves others, and so far as he serves others, so far is he taking care of himself, one hand washes the other. But wherever he finds himself, there he is in his right place, he makes use of others and is himself made use of. 342-343, beide Betrachtungsweisen, der positiven wie der negativen Beziehung des Endlichen auf das an sich, sein aber in der Tat gleich notwendig, und als ist also so sehr in sich, als es füreinander ist, oder als ist nützlich dort, als gibt sich anderen Press, lacht sich jetzt von anderen gebrochen und ist für sie, und jetzt stellt es sich, es so sagen, wieder auf die Hinterbein, tagsbrot gegen anderes, ist für sich und gebrot das andere seine sitzt dort, für den Menschen, als das. Diese Beziehung beübt Ding, ergibt sich daraus sein Wissen und sein Stellung. Ist, wie unmittelbar ist, als natürliches beübt seinen sich, Gott, als eins absolut, und anderes ist Carat ein, und so, der Verein als das seine beübt hier die Moment die Bedeutung der Allgemeinheit haben, ist als für sein Vernigen und der Gottslichkeit, und der Jet, wie US Gotts Hand gekommen, in der Welt als einem Verein gepflanzten Garten am dort, wie Ort vom Baum der Erkenntnis des Guten und des Bösen gepflegt haben, besitzt darin einen Nutzen, der ein von allem anderen Unterschiede, denn zufälligerweise ist seinen sich gut Nature auch so best scharf wenn, dafür das übermorgen der Gottslichkeit schädend hat, oder weil mir seine Einzelheit hat auch Chirurgen sitzen nahe, kann über sich selbst hinaus und sich zerstören. Hiergen ist ein die Vernunft ein nutzliches Mittel, dies hinaus gehörig zu bestranken oder weil mir im hinaus über das bestimmt sich selbst zu erhalten, denn dies ist die Kraft des Bewusstseins. Der Genufe des Bewusstseins sich allgemeinen Wissens Mufe nach Mannigfaltigkeit und Dauer selbst nicht ein bestimmts, sondern allgemein sein, das Mafi hat daher die Bestimmung, zu verhindern, dafür das Vernigen in seiner Mannigfaltigkeit und Dauer abgebrochen wird, die Bestimmung des Mafis ist die Anmafigkeit dort, wie die im Menschen als nützlich ist, so ist es ebenfalls und seine Bestimmung ebenso sehr, sich zum Gemenutzlichen und allgemein Brotschweren mit Gleich des Traps zu. Mädchen. So viel für sich sorgt, hat so viel für sich auch hergeben für die anderen, und so viel sich hergibt, so viel sorgt für sich selbst, ein Hand wascht die andere. Wo eben sich befindet, ist Riek darin, jetzt anderen und wird genietzt. 415-416, it is worth insisting for another moment on the positive dimension of this process of humanization, which to be sure leaves the inhabitants of its world vulnerable to objectification and instrumentalization, to themselves being treated as means rather than ends. This negative possibility constituted the very source of Kantian ethics and expressed the general distaste of the German philosophers, very much including Hegel, for England as a nation of shopkeepers as the very herdand of utilitarianism and commercialism. But the valences of the dialectic demand the registering of both positive and negative dimensions of a given phenomenon simultaneously, and are therefore necessarily distinct from moralizing critiques and judgments. Meanwhile what Hegel calls utility is prophetic of the Heideggerian being in the world and can assuredly be translated into what has been called Heidegger's pragmatism. Heidegger showed, indeed, that utility which he calls Zuhandenheit, or ready-to-handness, is the most immediate or primary dimension of the being of things and their constitution into a world, and not some mere human addition to nature as such, an erroneous concept he attributes to epistemology or to the more derivative experience of things as vorhanden or merely present in inert, contemplative fashion. There can to be sure be other objections to the celebration of a full humanization of the world and an end or subsumption of nature. It is indeed in this way that postmodernity has often been characterized, but we will come to them at the end of the present discussion. We must now dialectically identify this modern utilitarian world of objects confronted by post-revolutionary experience with its subjective analogue in post-Kantian ethics. For as we began to show above, it is the trace of production itself which characterized that ethics, and it is the recognition of that production in the objective world, the acknowledgement of my own activity in its social and material construction, that constitutes me as a citizen. Here, to be sure, the focus tends to shift from the object world of utility to the social world of the state and of laws, yet H.P.'s originality in his proposal for a post-Kantian ethics is to have reoriented the emphasis from obedience to the law and the state to the very production of these collective institutions. This feeling of collective property rather than individual property, of collective ownership rather than narrowly personal possession, is in Hegel's philosophy of activity and the very source of my identification with the post-revolutionary, utopian, society, and Kajev is right in identifying this participation as a far deeper satisfaction, Befriedigung, than mere consumption or abstract legal tide. Indeed, we can form a more concretely overdetermined view of this new object world, both as utilitarian or Zuhanden and as my externalization or the output of my own production, by bringing to light all the subterranean relationships that bind these themes to the phenomenon of the such selves discussed above. In the non-abstractable recognition of the experience of the thing itself, my acknowledgement of my vocation, of my deeper calling within the varieties of activity, there lies implicit the identification of the work as my own production as well as that recognition by other people of the usefulness of my labor for them, or in other words a universality which cannot be theorized or philosophized but exists at the level of that world of singular objects which is daily life. It is precisely this kind of identification which the former slave, now become ethical citizen, will ideally bring to the externalized object in which the subject is to see itself. And this is the deeper truth of the idea that the law will be acknowledged by virtue of the citizen's production of it. The revolutionary state is itself the construction and the achievement, the production, of its citizens, and that is the moral sense in which it belongs to them and in which obeying its laws is tantamount to obeying themselves. Political apathy, meanwhile, expresses the well-nigh literal alienation of the state, which still belongs to others and has nothing to do with me. It is thus scarcely a distortion to posit the humanized world of consumer society as that externalization in which the subject can find itself most completely objectified and yet most completely itself. The contradiction begins to appear when we set this cultural dimension alongside the legal and political levels of late capitalism, for it is with these that the Kantian ethical citizen ought to identify himself, according to the theory, and in these that he ought to be able to recognize his own subjectivity and the traces of his own production. But this is precisely what does not obtain today, where so many people feel powerless in the face of the objective institutions which constitute their world, and in which they are so far from identifying that legal and political world as their own doing and their own production. Here, despite the historical fact of production itself, the human world, which, as Vico put it, people have themselves produced, we find universal alienation of the most literal kind, in which the object, the not I, comes before its subjects as what is radically other and the property and dominion of a foreign power. Just as man is governed, in religion, by the products of his own brain, so, in capitalist production, he is governed by the products of his own hand. 37 Indeed, it is not sufficiently recognized that Marx's early philosophical theory of alienation, which remains a structural principle in capital at moments like this one, includes within its account of expropriation the more positive Hegelian demonstration that such externalized and alienated objects continue to belong to the worker in all senses of that word. Humanization of the world, the object world on the basis of H.P.'s transformation of his concept of recognition into that of the disalienation of a human age estranged from us and expressed in the religious language of acknowledgement and redemption to be found on the concluding page of his morality chapter, a page which on our reading concludes the phenomenology as such. We have constructed a later stage which remains a provisional one and by no means an historically final moment or end of history. This provisional halt, which corresponds to Hegel's own historical present, was then structured in the form of a double opposition or contradiction, an immense dialectical confrontation between the modern subject and its humanized object world. On the one hand, the modern subject is divided into abstract equality and richly private or existential individuality. On the other hand, a utilitarian world of objects confronts the alienated reality of the subject's production of the object world and of post-revolutionary secular society as such. This model of contradiction is no anachronistic superposition of contemporary themes and anxieties on an old-fashioned Hegelian system, but has been constituted by rearrangement of features and analyses already present in Hegel's chapters on contemporary history. A word on contradiction itself. We have here taken as a model the very structural logic of the Antigon chapter discussed earlier. The historically new opposition that emerged here between human and divine law, between the state and the clan, was not only a prophetic symptom of the dissolution of the social form it tore apart, but was also the very foundational moment of that social form in the first place. The polis was only able to come into being as a political form and a mode of production by virtue of the articulation of this constitutive opposition which ended up destroying it. It may now be appropriate to project a further play of opposites that takes these twin dialectics of subject and object speculatively into some far future of social revolution and ecological transformation. Capitalism, utilitarianism, humanization of the world. Consumption for us, collectivity, production for us, the end of classes, the human age. Alienation, globalization, universal unemployment, degradation of nature, the not ecology. The return of non-human terraforming as the production of nature. This is then what must also be said about the fundamental contradiction of modernity which has been outlined here. The articulation into its two dimensions of subjectivity and object world inaugurates modern society at the same time that it condemns it to dissolution. The contradiction signals the failure of the social system, provided one understands that in that sense all social systems are failures. As Slavoj to Isaac puts it, does not Hegel's phenomenology tell us again and again the same story of the repeated failure of the subject's endeavor to realize his project in social substance? 38 Yet from another perspective what is crucial about contradiction is that its very emergence signals the interiorization of the opposites, which no longer confront each other in external and contingent ways. This interiorization might then be grasped as a kind of historical progress from Hegel's perspective, although it is surely to be understood as a structural rather than a teleological, let alone a cyclical, movement. I propose that, with the hindsight of Marx's dialectic in Capital, we understand this progression in the sense of enlargement, as of a spiral rather than of a circular or cyclical process. We have already posited the essence of the Hegelian universal as the presence to and within the subject of other people. What then is more predictable, at least in our earthly human history, than the progressive enlargement of that population of others to be included in the fateful philosophical world? It is indeed a commonplace of historiography from well before Hegel's own philosophy of history that the failure of the Greek city-states, the drama of Antigon, is predicated on their spatial limits and their resultant multiplicity, and that they are overcome by the enlargement of a single city-state into an empire, and its subsequent unification of the ancient world. For unity is the other constant in this process, and the unity and dimensions of the revolutionary nation-state are in this sense a further progression. Hegel's system itself thereby calls in its very structure for the subsequent enlargements of later history, first the moment of imperialism, or the modern in the technical sense, and now that of globalization. These subsequent enlargements are very much in the spirit of the Hegelian dialectic and also explain why Hegel's own practice is no longer to be associated with dilemmas of modernity as Pippin would have it, but must now be reconjugated in terms of a world market that is only in the process of finding and inventing the conceptuality appropriate to it.